If you want one very important tip on the general technique of a writer, give yourself an accounting always of what you like or what you don't like in your reading. And always give yourself reasons. You'll find that at first you might identify only the immediate reasons of your preference or your estimate of any given paragraph or book. As you practice it, you'll find that you will go deeper and deeper. That is, that your approach will become more complex and you'll be able to identify more reasons. It's in that manner that you form your own literary taste and that you put it under your conscious control. You don't have to memorize your premises. Merely store them in your subconscious and they will be there when you need them, if you work on it long enough. Or if you want to be at home with the art of writing, this is what you have to do. Be very conscious of why you're doing things, but don't attempt to edit yourself while in the process of writing. You know the old expression that you can't change horses in the middle of a stream. Well, it applies here. You can't change premises in the middle of writing. When you actually start writing, you have to rely on whichever premises you have in your subconscious. You can't start doubting yourself and editing yourself on every sentence that comes out. Write as it comes to you, in effect. Then, the next morning preferably, you can turn editor, read over and consciously weigh what you have written, and if something does not satisfy you, ask yourself then consciously why, and try to figure out what premise you missed. But don't attempt to be editor and writer at the same time. That's a mistake that many people make, and I made very often. And it's a great effort of will to stop myself from doing it, because the tendency one would fall into. If you're very conscious of what you're writing, the tendency will be to edit a sentence in your mind before you put it down on paper. And that's an impossible process. It will stop you immediately. So that you have to tell yourself to trust your subconscious. If it doesn't deliver the kind of material you want, well, it'll at least give you the evidence of what's wrong and what to correct or what to think over further. But don't attempt to do it by conscious calculation while you're writing, because that can be done. Now, at this point, I wanted to mention a small question, a small aside, which I fully expect someone to ask me sooner or later, so I'll just include it here. You might ask, why is it that there are so many writers, and a great many of them very good ones, who are not on our philosophy? How is it that they practice a lot of the right premises without ever knowing them consciously and not necessarily even agreeing with the kind of premises that go into writing? Well, the answer is very simple. Most people are not conscious philosophers. They are not aware of what kind of philosophies they hold, and they're not aware of the kind of premises that go into their actions. A man could very well have the right or part right. By right, I mean rational, literary premises, and be a very good writer, even though his conscious convictions would be a contradiction to the premises which he uses to write. As you note, to hold contradictory premises is the fate of 99% of mankind, or much more. Therefore, there's nothing astonishing about that. People survive only to the extent to which, in some aspect of their life, they do hold the right premises, even if they contradict it in all the rest of their life. So it's quite possible for a writer to have good literary premises while holding an opposite philosophy. You know, very many people, the example of which in Atlas Shrugged will be Dr. Stadler, who has good rational premises in relation to his work, but not in relation to anything else, which incidentally is why he destroys himself eventually. But a writer could very easily, by default, meaning by imitation or by feeling, get the right premises and function on them, and most writers do. They would not be able to identify for you the rules and the reasons for their writing. They will say, I just write because it comes to me, and they fully believe that they have some innate talent or that some mystical power dictates to them. Now don't try to count on that mystical power to give you the talent. Because if any of you were tempted to ask me, well, why couldn't I just rely on instinct? What do I need my philosophy for? My answer would be, your instinct hasn't worked for you so far. You don't have writing premises. And more, the mere doubt is what indicates it. And more than that, even if you had writing premises, or what people conventionally would call, you showed indications of talent, you could stay on the same level for a whole career and never rise to writing what you really want. In other words, to establish your literary premises or to develop such as you might already have, what you need is a conscious knowledge. And that is what I hope to help you with in this course. Now, we were talking about the fact that art is an objectivization of your values. The particular point I wanted to stress for you is what is the tool of a writer. Various arts have various tools, but obviously writing is a form of art which uses language as its tool. Whichever you create as writers has to be created by means of language. And here comes the most important point of all for you to remember, that language is an objective instrument and has to consist of words with objective meanings. Now, the fact that most people today consider words inarticulate sounds is disastrous for them in every way. No man can think without an objective language, but for a writer, it's the greatest disaster of all. If you approach writing with the idea of, well, I sort of know what I mean, and my words sort of express something, the result will be exactly of the same kind. You will have nobody but yourself to blame if nobody gets your meaning, or they get the opposite meaning, and your book is not what you intended. You cannot hope to even approach the idea of writing seriously without the most ruthlessly strict premise about the fact that every word you use should have an objective meaning. By that I mean, if you are not sure of any word, look it up in a dictionary, preferably in an old dictionary, because the modern ones are getting non-objective. But if you get any of, let's say, of the 20s preferably, you'll be safer. Sometimes, even in best dictionaries, some words are defined very loosely. What does a writer do in that sense? Give it your own definition. If some words are defined approximately, and you'll find that the word value, reason, morality, all the important words are in dictionary definitions, usually very loose. Don't use it in that manner. Define in your own mind specifically what you mean, and when you use a word, make clear by your context in what kind of meaning you use that word. Now that is a thinking discipline, which is very important for you as people generally, but it has been valuable for you as writers. The trouble with the kind of writers I mentioned last time who complained that they never write exactly what they wanted to, that it never expresses what they wanted, are guilty, among other faults, of the fact that their words are approximate, even in their own mind. Most writers, you will find, will use words in very loose meaning, and in effect, the public today is accustomed to reading books as a kind of package deal, that if you sort of get the general drift of a paragraph, that's about all that you can get, and that's all that the writer intended. Well, that is the reason why most books are so bad today. If you want to be exact writers, and rational writers, you must treat words as you would in a legal document. it doesn't mean that you have to use awkward sentences. That means a very difficult assignment, that you use words with absolute clarity and yet manage to project violent emotion, color, any of the literary qualities that you wish by precise means instead of relying on a lot of implied wittiness. As far as precision of language is concerned, I would say I think I am the best writer in that respect today. At least I don't know any other. As far as non-precision goes, I would say, just as an example, there are much worse ones, but as a famous example, Thomas Wolfe, because there is a man who uses an incredible amount of words, none of them precisely. If you ever want to see how not to write, read some of his descriptive passages. I will discuss that in greater detail when we come to style. But whenever you have an unsatisfied feeling in reading some writer, or a feeling of you know but not quite what it is that he meant, look for one of the faults will be the fact that his words are not exact. There's one sentence in Atlas Shrugged which I would like to quote here because it's applicable to all good rational people, but particularly to writers. It's a sentence about Dagny, where I say that she used words as if she was under oath, an oath of allegiance to reality. Now that, I think, should be the motto of every writer in relation to words. In this context, I want to tell you to remember that language, words, are all abstractions. With the exception of proper names, every word you use is an abstraction. And in order to use it properly, you have to be very clear in your own mind of what concretes belong under that abstraction. If you don't want to use floating abstractions and meaningless words, and if you want to have your style come to you easily, to have words come and express the exact shade of meanings that you want, one of the things to do to achieve it is to know very clearly the exact definition, the exact concretes of the abstractions which you're using. For instance, you wouldn't have any trouble with the abstraction table. I mean, the word table is an abstraction, and it stands for what? Any table you've ever seen or will see. So that if you try to project in your mind what do you mean by table, you won't have any difficulty of visualizing any number of concrete examples. But when it comes to words like individualism, or freedom, or rationality, most of you might be able to name just one or two examples and stop there. And I don't mean this insultingly, because most people outside this room wouldn't be able to name even one concrete correctly under abstractions of that kind. I know that all of you here have some idea of what kind of concretes would illustrate the meaning of these abstractions. But if you know only one or two, that is not enough. In order to be completely free with words, you should know as many concretes as you can possibly project. And if you attempt to start defining words that you're using, it will be a very good exercise if you attempt to see how many concretizations you can give to any abstraction that you're using or are dealing with in daily life and conversation. You'll find that some of your definitions will be on this order. Well, individualism, that is when man is free. And you see, that's not a concrete nor a definition, and that won't get you anywhere. Have precise definitions and then try to project mentally the kind of concretes that would illustrate the abstraction which you're using. Now, here I wanted to point out to you the tremendous role which the relationship of abstractions to concretes plays in all creative writing, not only in the composition of a sentence, but in the composition of a whole story in every paragraph and every chapter of it. What you really do when you write a story is what I call a circle of this kind. You start with an abstraction, which will be your plot theme or your philosophical theme, but some general idea of what the story will be like. That is an abstraction. Then you have to find what concretes will give you the sum which will add up to that particular abstraction. And when the reader reads your story, the process is reversed. He reads first the concretes and then adds them up to the abstraction with which you started. When I say reader, of course, I mean a rational reader. You can't count on or address yourself to any other. Now, let me give you an illustration of this. For instance, if I start Atlas Shrugged with the very general theme of the importance of the mind, of reason. Now, that is a very wide abstraction. Yet I want the reader to be left with that message. What would I have to do? I would have to include all the important or key aspects of the specific way in which reason is important in human life. What does it mean? Well, I would have to show what is reason, how does it operate, why is it important. How a sequence of the construction of the John Galt line was in fact included in my outline of the story for that purpose. That was to concretize, to show what is it that the mind does in human life. Then, what happens if it's absent? Well, the whole rest of the novel is in effect an illustration of it, but most particularly the chapter on the tunnel catastrophe. Because there I show exactly in concrete events what happens to a world where men do not dare to sing and do not dare take the responsibility of judgment. If at the end of the novel you're left with the impression, yes, the mind is important and we should live by reason, it's those incidents that did it. You read the concretes, but they summed up in your mind into the abstraction with which I started and which I had to break down into concretes. Now, I named only a few, because in fact every chapter and every paragraph would have been set up on exactly the same kind of principle. What is the overall abstraction I want to convey? Then, what concretes will illustrate it? The mistake that young writers can make, and we'll discuss this at greater length when we come to characterization, is the idea that you have a floating abstraction, but you don't know quite how to express it. So that if you want a hero, and you want him to be strong, independent, and rational, let's say, you're stuck there. You don't know what to do, and you might have state in narrative merely tell that, well, the hero was strong, independent, and rational. That doesn't convey anything. You might have other characters discussing him, pay him all these compliments. That doesn't accomplish anything. The fact is that strong, independent, and rational are abstractions. And in order to know how to have the reader be left with those abstractions in his mind as a result of reading about your character, you have to provide the kind of concrete which will make the reader conclude, yes, this man is strong because he did so and so. He is independent because he defied so and so. He is rational because here's what he connected or here's what he thought. This was very rational of him. It's on that process of concretization that the whole power of your abstractions will rest. Otherwise, they are floating abstractions. It is on the power to do precisely this kind of circle and to calculate it very consciously that your success will rest. Now, before we go on, I wanted to insert at this point a slight aside in regard to a question which Kathy Moore asked me before we started. She asked me what I meant by the concretization of values. I don't know whether everyone understood me first time or not. Would you raise your hands if there's any vagueness in your mind on this point? Or does everyone understand it clearly? The objectivization, yeah, beg your pardon. Was it clear to you in what sense I meant it? Well, Kathy asked whether this meant that one merely states one's values. That would be on the order of what I just mentioned, of just naming abstractions or stating your abstract beliefs and considering that the presentation of your values. That is not what I meant, of course. I meant that all art consists of presenting values, making them real, presenting them in concrete form. Again, what are human values? They are abstractions. For instance, you consider courage a value. Merely saying in a book that I think courage is good is not an objectivization of your values. But presenting a man who acts bravely is. Therefore, the concretization of your values means the presentation of that which you consider good. And don't be misled by the fact that so many books and works of art present depravity or ugliness or crime. That is their values. If a man believes in a malevolent universe, if he thinks that life is depravity, if, for instance, James Taggart were to project his values, he would do nothing but studies of sewers and stories of human depravity, because that would be his view of life, and that is what he would try to present objectively. Now, Kathy also asked me, what is the purpose of art? Why is it important to objectify values? Well, values are an abstraction. Before it can become real to anyone or convince anyone, the concretes have to be given. It's in that sense that every writer is a moralist. If you present a code of moral values, and by this I don't mean a new morality like gold, but simply a view of life, your view of life and of man's relation to existence, you have to present it in action and in concrete so that men will be able to understand you. It's in this sense that every artist properly is an Aristotelian. Abstractions don't exist. Abstractions are only a name for concrete. All that exists is concrete. If you want to present your view of what is valuable to man, of what is man, what is his existence, or what should it be, you have to present it in concrete forms, because that's the only thing that really exists. And from that, men will gather the right abstractions. That is, if you're a good writer, they will gather the abstractions you intended. In that sense, every writer is a moral philosopher. And Kathy asked me, what is the purpose of projecting your values? Well, it's as important a purpose as discovering new laws of nature or writing technical textbooks. It's in effect teaching men how to live. And the worst kind of malevolent universe, gutter study, is evil in that respect, because intended or not, its net result is that the writer is projecting to men how he thinks men do or should live. And now this will bring us to the first concretization of the different schools of literature. I want to tell you in a little more detail what we discussed briefly in our preliminary sessions. That is that the two great schools of writing, of plays, but most particularly novels, can be divided into two main groups, the naturalistic and the romantic. The naturalistic, sometimes also called realistic, is the school which believes in presenting things as they are, so-called. The romantic, things as they ought to be. Now you remember we discussed that the basic philosophic premise which will determine whether a writer will belong to one school or the other is the premise of determinism versus free will. If the writer's basic conviction is that man is a determined creature, that he has no choice, that he is the plaything of circumstances or fate or background or God or his glance, that writer, no matter what he writes, will belong to the school of naturalism. The essence of that school will be that they present man as helpless. That man is a passive plaything and something controls his actions, and in effect he is a lead hunsaker who can't help it. Now you have some very great writers in that school. Nevertheless, philosophically, it is a very evil school, and its particular literary flaw is that it's the school of plotless writers. That we discussed, and I will come back to the question of why plot is essential when we come to discuss plot. At this point, I think you all know why. If a writer believes that men are determined beings, he will not be able nor willing to devise a plot, because a plot necessarily presupposes man's freedom to choose and ability to achieve a purpose. Now, the archetype of the naturalistic school of writing is Tolstoy. In America, I would say Sinclair Lewis is a very good writer, whom I personally like and who have a great many good literary qualities, but he is strictly a naturalistic writer. He presents studies of the kind of men which he sees around him. He presents studies of men whom he observed, not men as they could be and ought to be, but men as he has seen them. In effect, that school presents statistical averages. A man whom the naturalistic school would regard as a good human study is a man whom many people have seen often, or a man who exists in many varied, therefore is called typical. Now, most of Sinclair Lewis characters are exactly that. Babbitt being the arch example of presenting a statistical type and presenting it very well, which became a word in the language, because it had identified a type no one had described before. Nevertheless, it's not a value projection in the sense of an abstraction of what a man should be. It's a very skillful presentation of the type of man that is encountered in America in great numbers. It's a statistical average. We also discussed in our preliminary groups the fact that Shakespeare is a writer of the naturalistic school, because Shakespeare is an arch-determinist. All of his plays are based on the general theme that man is a plaything of fate, or a victim of the tragic flaw, so-called, that man cannot help his destiny and he carries in himself the flaw that necessarily destroys him and he's helpless about it. Now, that is the naturalistic school at its best. By that I mean in a grand manner or on a philosophical scale. The bottom of that school is what you read today. Most of the novels today are the extreme exaggeration of the blind alley of that school. Observe this, that if a writer believes philosophically that man is determined, that he can't help being what he is, and therefore in order to present his view of human nature, he has to resort to the statistical method, that he has to conclude man is that by nature of which I see the most of. On that view, statistically, he is not going to find very many typical admirable men or heroic men. Statistically, in view of the kind of philosophy and moralities that the world holds, he'll find much more stupidity, depravity, and evil than heroism and virtue. And if at first the naturalistic school presented at least serious problems or serious types of men, at best men of mixed quality, who had some good and some evil in them, but couldn't help it one way or the other, the blind alley of that school, the end of the road, is presenting nothing but such caricatures of depravity that they're not even realistic. I would challenge anyone to find the kind of types that Faulkner or Erskine Caldwell write about. They would probably be more exceptional than the kind of people I write about. I do not believe that creatures of that kind could survive to their 21st year. Or they perhaps exist somewhere in the mountains of the south, one or two of them. What those writers do is take the most vicious that they ever heard of and blow it up and exaggerate it into the grotesquely vicious. And this is presented under the guise that such is life. Or the kind of stories you've been reading about dope fiends and drunkards, and the dullest kind of depravity, the sole excuse of presenting which is, well, it exists. I challenge whether it does exist quite in that form. B, if it does, what's the point of presenting it? The excuse which those writers give is, well, that is their view of life. If they are determinists, then necessarily their view will be that life is whichever they have observed around them, or whichever they've chosen to observe, and even the fact of their choice is determined. They would in logic have to say that I was drawn to that kind of depravity, I couldn't help it any more than my characters. Now, the only protection against them is that the readers have free choice and do not have to read that stuff. Now, the romantic school of writing, in a general way, approaches life on the premise that man has free will and has the capacity of choice. Therefore, that is the school, the distinguishing mark of which will be a good plot. By plot, I mean, as I've said, a purposeful progression of events, which, as we discussed before, means that man can set his own goals and can achieve them. It's only a human purpose that will give you a good plot structure. The trouble, however, with the romantic school as it has existed is that on the kind of morality that the world holds, on the mind and body split morality, there was no real way in which men could place their values in reality. Therefore, you will observe that most novels of the Romantic school in the 19th century and today are always placed in some historical past. That is why all plot novels today are costume dramas. The implication being that man can conceive of projecting values in some reality which is not the present. Another age, another set of circumstances, almost another dimension. What they cannot do is combine the reality of the present with a value, a free will view of men. Present men as they ought to be today in conditions which are rationally open to the reader. All the historical dramas that do present values, usually in a very crude, primitive way, present at least heroes and villains, even if simplified, all of them are singularly detached from any possible practical consequences. Is that there is no way in which those values, except very generalized way, could be applied to the present or could be applied to man's actual life. There are a few exceptions, which I'll name later. But I'm now talking of the general school. For instance, today, if you want a good story that will hold your interest, and even there, it's becoming more and more rare, still you might be able to find a costume novel. Now, the guttural level of this school, I mean the equivalent of the Faulkners and Erskine Caldwells, will be the adventure story or all the pulp magazine thriller. And here's a particular observation that I wanted to call to your attention. If you've ever read those pulp thrillers, who usually have very good plots, you'll observe this, that they are completely devoid of any value application to reality. As an example, I will cite a little pocket book that Leonard Peikoff gave me to read recently, which in fact was very good of its kind as a plot structure. I had asked him to tell me if he knew of a good plot story, because I'm miserably bored by any other, and he gave me one that was a good plot, and it also served as a marvelous example of certain kind of flow in the whole of our literature. Now, that story was called Seven Steps to Satan. I suppose all of you have read it, because I've heard you talking about it. But for those who have not read it, I can tell you in a couple of words what it is. It's simply the story about a man who becomes the prisoner of an arch-villain who pretends that he is Satan and manipulates other people and creates horrible evils, is completely amoral. And the sole purpose for which he's doing all this is to rob jewelry out of museums and to amuse himself by playing chess with human beings, in effect. That is, by raising their hopes and then destroying them or granting them favors. It is a totally senseless and meaningless conception. Now, the story is very exciting in the sense that the writer knows how to keep up his suspense, how to keep up the mystery, when to introduce an unexpected event. But the total has no meaning whatever. It does not even have the meaning of a good detective story or a Western. Because in a detective story or a Western, you have the primitive conflict of good and evil. You have the good fighting the evil and always winning. Even though the terms of the values are very primitive, the conflict is there, and the good does win. So it has a kind of very crudely primitive moral pattern. But this type of science fiction or fantasy thriller does not even have that kind of combat. The moral, if you can call it that, the message there is not that the good wins. Usually the hero escapes, but that is not the point. The point is that the values involved are totally meaningless and inapplicable to this earth. You have heard the Romantic school of writing called escape literature. This particular type of thriller is an escape, but not in the usual sense. It is metaphysically and philosophically worse than merely escape from your problems or escape from the drudgery of your own existence, which would be a very legitimate form of enjoyment. here it's actually an escape from values and from the mind. In this sense, if you want to read an exciting story, the only thing that can make it exciting, the only thing that can in fact hold your interest is some kind of value. To read a story with a good plot, you have to be on a moral premise, at least for the duration of that story. Now, in a thriller of this kind, which features a fantastic and impossible kind of senseless villain, the escape for the reader consists of dropping all values. That is, the reader has the advantage of reading about a struggle, yet not being involved with any values that could apply to his actual existence. There is nothing that he could learn as an abstraction from a story of that kind that would apply to his daily life or to himself. And it's in this sense that the two predominant schools, the naturalistic and the romantic, are both escape from values. If the naturalistic school in effect tells you that there are no values, since you have no choice, you can't help being what you are, and whatever happens to you happens because of destiny. You can't choose. You can't set your own goals. The low-grade romantic school of literature tells you, yes, there are values, only they don't apply to your life. Yes, you can have thrilling adventures and purposes, only they have nothing to do with your life on earth. And it's in this sense that the first, the naturalists, are in effect the philosophical expression of the materialists, or what I call in Atlas the mystics of muscle, where men are determined beings without any values whatever. The romantic school, particularly on its lower reaches, is the mystics of spirit. Strangely enough, that cheap pulp literature is actually the expression of a religious morality in the metaphysical sense, namely that values do exist somewhere on Mars or in another dimension, but not on Earth, not as applicable to you.
Good point.
Thank you.
Do you
Question?
about all the romantic school or specifically the modern romantic school?
No, I said the lower reaches of the romantic school. The definition there would not always be exact. Namely, it would include all the science fiction thrillers or general adventure thrillers which present the kind of adventures or issues that have no possible counterpart in reality. That is, have no abstraction involved that you could take as symbolically or as abstractly applying to your own life. It's the same principles we discussed in regard to fantasy stories. That is, if a fantasy is merely a symbol for a serious moral issue, that is a legitimate form of writing. But this school would include all the kind of fantasies which have no particular meaning whatever. It will be all the stories of the Ant-Man from Mars invading the Earth, or monsters with 3 legs and 2 tails, and no moral meaning of any kind, symbolical or metaphorical. It will be struggle and fight with no values that man can actually apply to himself. Also, most of the lesser costume dramas would be that the better ones usually have some issue which can be applied to modern life, usually in a very generalized way. But the cheaper historical novel that consists of nothing but chases and duels and swinging from chandeliers literally has no particular application beyond the hero won the girl or he won the buried gold. no moral beyond that. So in effect, reading about it, you are not reading about any kind of values that you could apply to yourself. Now, do you see why on the kind of philosophies that the world has held, this had to be the fate of literature? I want you particularly to observe in what way the very general philosophical abstractions will show up in writing. And this quite apart from any message that the writer delivers, quite apart from whether the writer makes speeches on the theme of his book or not. The nature of the story, the approach to the story, the implicit presentation of man's relation to existence will be expressed philosophically so long as it's a story, even a plotless one, whether the writers intended it or not. Now observe that if man's predominant morality through all known history has been a set of values based on another dimension, a standard based on another dimension not pertaining to your life on earth, the result in literature will have to be that either men who claim that there are no values anywhere, no morality, and that's the naturalistic school, or men who attempt to present values but can only succeed in placing them in a form totally divorced from any practical application or actual life. Now there are some exceptions. As I mentioned before, the greatest of the writers whom I consider my closest ancestor literarily is Victor Hugo. Now here is a romantic writer who, in fiction form, presented values as they applied to human life. He is one of the few who who did write a very great novel in contemporary terms, that is contemporary to him, and that's Les Miserables. That's one of the very few, in fact, offhand I can't think of any other, romantic novels in realistic terms of his time. All his other novels are historical and placed in earlier periods. But Les Miserables was a novel of his own time, in fact taking in practically the whole spread of the 19th century and of his contemporary society. As I mentioned in our preliminary discussions, I certainly do not agree with Hugo's philosophy. None of us would. His values were loosely Christian and somewhat vaguely socialistic. That is not what concerns us here. When we're discussing the basic form of a novel or of a literary school, we're discussing the method which a man employed in projecting his view of man's relationship to existence. Now, Hugo did project his values in terms of action, in terms of plot, in concrete reality, and as he saw them to apply to men of his own time. That is, he intended them to be taken as a guide, as a projection of values that did apply to existence. The theme of Les Miserables, you know, is a very primitive and socialistic one, that is the exploitation of the poor and the tragedy of the people, of whom the hero is a symbol. But observe this, Hugo is not a realistic writer. He's a romantic not only in the general structure of his novels, but even in the way he treats his character. For instance, Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, who is supposed to be the people, is a giant of a size that any aristocrat could be glad to be. I mean, he is anything but the common man. He is not a statistical average. He is Hugo's abstraction of what a good, allegedly simple man would be, who is honest and follows the Christian morality and is persecuted all his life. Now the other writer, whom I mentioned before, who is very close to my view of Romanticism, is O. Henry. Again, here's a writer with a very strong sense of values, translated into concrete action, and here laid into a strictly modern period, the period of his time, and almost journalistic terms, except that his journalistic terms are not the journalism of today. What you'll observe is that he never presents a realistic study of the kind of types he uses. He presents essences. He presents Wall Street men or financiers or working girls or con men tremendously idealized, or what we call stylized. They are not statistical copies of the kind of people he saw. They are creations out of his own abstraction of what human beings could be and ought to be. The overall moral message of O. Henry, as I would translate it, of the sum of his stories, isn't life interesting? That is the benevolent universe element in him. Here is a man who is presenting not what people statistically are doing, but what people could do if they were imaginative and what they could make of life. What are the interesting potentialities in life? True, he had a lot of technical weaknesses of an unimportant kind, namely he overused coincidence in some of his lesser stories. There's too much made of coincidence, which I would not advise any of you to copy merely on the ground that he used it. But these are not in his best stories. What is remarkable in his best stories is the magnificent imagination of constructing plot in such a way that every step leads to a logical, unexpected conclusion, and the overall is that exuberant, benevolent universe sense of life. Life as it ought to be, if people were a little more imaginative than they statistically are. Now, that is a real romantic realist, which brings me to the definition of my school of writing, which, as you know, I call romantic realism. And by now, it's clear to you what I mean by this term. Romantic in the sense that I present men as they ought to be. Realistic in the sense that I place them here and now and on this earth in terms that apply to every rational reader who would share these values and wants to apply them to himself. It's realistic in the sense that it is possible to man and it applies to this earth. It's romantic in the sense that it projects values and men as they ought to be, not statistical averages. Now there is one word which I want to add here in relation to characterization. We'll take that in greater detail when we come to it. But I want you to observe this, that there are two schools of characterization which do not necessarily follow the overall metaphysical intention of a novelist. For instance, you can write a statistical characterization like Sinclair Lewis, which consists of taking a statistical average, a representative type, and presenting him in minute detail, giving him those attributes which are typical of all the numbers that he represents. And that's the journalistic or naturalistic treatment of a character. The opposite form of characterization is presenting a character by means of his essence. Now the second is the romantic method. We discussed that briefly before. The way I present characters in The Fountainhead, in Atlas Shrugged, in fact in everything I've ever written, is not by means of minute details of a particular narrow journalistic type, but by means of essences. That which is essential to a certain kind of man on certain kind of premises. And you see there are two ways in which people can regard characters in fiction and tell you that they recognize them. For instance, on the naturalistic school, you will very often say that character so-and-so is just exactly like the fox next door. In fact, that's kind of the slogan of the naturalistic school, that characters are like the fox next door. The people who consider that real are usually the readers who would not consider the abstract characters real. They are the kind of whom you hear a lot who tell me that I write about people who don't exist. On the other hand, people who are able to think in essences, to see the essence, not the minute catalog of details, will tell me that I write about the kind of people they see all over the place. They will, for instance, recognize Peter Keating in The Fountainhead. That I've heard from a number of people who even tell me names of architects I never heard of, and they swear that I copied Peter Keating from that particular architect. Well, you see why that is so. If I present the essence of that which makes a second-hander like Peter Keating, they will be able to recognize that essence properly in a great many people who will not have Keating's particular appearance or mannerisms or personal problems, but who will have the same essence. Now that is categorizing man by means of abstraction. The result of his approach to characterization, or rather, the cause of it, is the epistemology of thinking in abstraction, meaning in a very careful definition, meaning in knowing what is essential in a man or in any object or in any issue, and what is accidental, and presenting that which is essential, that which in fact is universal, not typical.
What did you mean by saying that this doesn't necessarily follow? I didn't get the exact phrase of something metaphysical.
The characterization used will not necessarily follow the metaphysical view of the writer in relation to the basic schools, naturalism or realism. What did I mean? I was just coming to it. Now, what I meant is that there are instances of crossbreeding or mixed types. Shakespeare is the best example of it, because here is a writer of the naturalistic school, of the determinist school, but his method of characterization is by means of essences and abstraction. He does not present naturalistic studies of particular men. He presents the essence of whatever problem or type he is dealing with, such as, for instance, King Lear will be the essence of all the jealous or dominating fathers. Hamlet was supposedly the essence of the doubting intellectual. Or Othello, the essence of jealousy, of a jealous man. It will always be the universal abstraction pertaining to a certain type or issue, and man created according to it. I think one of the reasons of Shakespeare's fame and immortality is precisely that. That is that he presents in a serious philosophical view, method, that is the method of characterization by essences, is a thinker's method, and a method which transcends any particular time or range of the moment or any century. He presents human essences on the basis of the kind of philosophy which most of mankind shares. That is determinism, fate, and that man is the helpless placing of outside forces. That philosophy is so prevalent that Shakespeare is in effect the grandest scale, the best thinker, the best literary representative of it. Now Tolstoy, who is the other great naturalist, his characters are not abstractions. They are the typical naturalistic studies of a particular period. Incidentally, they are so typically Russian They're so narrowly of one culture that anyone who likes Tolstoy and raves about his universality is just uttering floating abstractions. None of his characters would have any counterpart in any other country except on the loosest kind of abstraction, such as an unfaithful woman. Well, she can exist in any country. Or a young man seeking the meaning of life. Yes, that can exist in any country, but that is hardly developed in any kind of terms that would apply beyond this floating abstraction to any other country. His particular characters are national and local studies of a certain period. And the same is even more true of any lesser writer of that school. Now, Sinclair Lewis, whom I admire very much as a very skillful and intelligent writer, has done a remarkable job on presenting characters typical of a certain period in a certain country. But if you read Babbitt today, it is already dated. It is a historical document in the sense that a good newspaper file would be a historical document. It is a good representation of an average type of a certain period, nothing more. On the other hand, in the Romantic school, you will also see that kind of crossbreeding. And I think the worst in this respect is the Romantic novel with a realistic or naturalistic treatment of characters. Most sleek magazine stories are that. In other words, they would be romantic in the sense that they would have a plot and some kind of value conflict, some sort of code of values involved, but the characters would not be treated as any kind of abstractions, any kind of essences. They will be mainly naturalistic studies, or what I call statistical method studies, very poorly done, because they don't fit into that medium. I think that would be a good time now, since it's 5 of 10 to stop.